That was President Biden in Philadelphia talking about voting rights. The president is calling on Congress to pass federal voting legislation, calling election laws being passed or considered around the country, quote, the most dangerous threat to voting and the integrity of free and fair elections in our history. The president's address comes as Texas House Democrats are in Washington today after leaving their state in an effort to block a Republican election bill there. Among other provisions, that bill would ban 24-hour polling locations and drive-through voting, which have increased turnout among minorities. It would prohibit election officials from sending absentee ballot applications to people who haven't requested them, and it would give partisan poll watchers greater access to polling sites. Now Texas Democrats are calling on U.S. Congress, like the president, to pass federal legislation to outlaw these restrictions. And let's bring in ABC News political director Rick Klein, congressional correspondent Rachel Scott, and Zoreen Shah, who's live in Austin, Texas, for us with more on this. Rachel, I want to start with you. One of President Biden's most applauded lines just there was when he said the big lie is just that, a big lie, referring to former President Trump's false claims that the 2020 election was stolen. So how did those claims factor into this wave of new election laws that we're seeing being considered or passed across the country?
Yeah, Diane, and it's interesting because the president also pointed out the fact that we have seen 17 states so far pass laws that make it harder for people to vote. And that's why he's calling on Congress to act. When you talk to Republicans in these states, they say this is all about restoring voter confidence in the election system, voter integrity, they will say. But the fact of the matter is when you look at a lot of what these laws would do, a lot of what these proposed bills would do, as you just outlined with the Texas bill specifically, it does make it harder for people to vote, especially for communities of color. And so that is why you have these Texas lawmakers here in Washington, D.C. today. They say that their backs are up against the wall. I had an opportunity to talk to a few of them when they landed last night. 50 flew over on 2 private charter planes. I was at their hotel early this morning. They say their hands are tied here, that they need Congress to do its job. But let me tell you, the president and Democrats, they face an uphill battle on getting any voting rights legislation passed right now.
Zoreen, let's take it to Texas there. Rachel just mentioned how much of this Texas bill is designed to roll back changes that were made due to the pandemic, and how much do you think is implementing new restrictions?
You know, some of the changes actually did come about because of the pandemic. It was intended to make voting easier, and it certainly did that during the pandemic. Now, this bill intends to roll back some of those changes and then some. But I want to give you a reaction to some of those potential changes. I'm on the ground here in Texas, here in Austin, and mind you, this is a very blue city. I mean, bluer than this Sharpie right here. But the people we spoke to had a range of opinions when we asked them about this bill. One of them, the first one, anecdotally actually said that they're not happy with their lawmakers fleeing this state. They want their lawmakers to compromise. And just seconds ago, in fact, I can just hear it. It's right above me. There is a plane overhead with the banner. Just to give you a little bit of this range, that banner says, "Don't mess with Texas voter, y'all." So speaks for a little bit about what the folks here in Austin think.
And now, Rick, the whole point of these Texas lawmakers going to D.C. is because, like we heard from the president today, they're trying to put pressure on Congress to pass federal voting legislation. But it's not like Congress wasn't already trying to work on federal voting legislation. Democrats in the U.S. Senate ultimately don't have the votes to make it happen right now. So how realistic is it that this move by Texas lawmakers or this speech by the president now is going to change that?
They still don't have the votes, either in Austin or in Washington. This doesn't change the calculus. The Republicans almost certainly will prevail eventually in Texas. And those lawmakers that Rachel's been talking to who flew here last night acknowledged that there's very little they can do other than continue to stay out of the state. They're essentially fugitives right now. They're subject to arrest if they return back to Texas. And they'd have to sit out maybe the next year and a half of any legislative action to wait through the rest of the legislative session. Realistically speaking, they're not going to prevail there. And in Washington, the math is just as stubborn as ever. The filibuster still applies, so Democrats would need to find 10 Republicans to join them. That's not happening for the bills they're talking about. Or they need to change the rules. They don't have unanimity on that. They don't even have unanimous support for the For the People Act that President Biden outlined today is so critical. So this is about the Democrats trying to ratchet up public pressure, particularly on just a handful of senators who are resistant to changing that filibuster rule, hoping that at the national level, Democrats can do something that at the state level they haven't been able to. which is to implement new voting protections that flow against the restrictions that Republicans are passing in states like Georgia and now on the next up, Texas.
And Rick, earlier I spoke to one of those Texas lawmakers who's there in D.C. now, and I posed that question to her, and she seemed like she was angling more toward trying to get Democrats to change the filibuster rule rather than trying to get them to solicit enough Republican support to get the law passed with the rules in place. But Senator Manchin has been adamant that he will not support eliminating the filibuster, and he's not the only Democrat who's in general against it. So is there any way these lawmakers are going to be able to sway him?
Well, you heard President Biden reference this, and Vice President Harris has as well. They're looking for what they're describing as carve-outs, essentially topic areas that could not be subject to a filibuster. That's how it works with judicial confirmations, as to much of the Democrats' chagrin during the Trump years. Democrats didn't have any power to stop President Trump's Supreme Court appointments. And we know that also for the budget process, that there's a way around it. Now, it's a very slippery slope if you start to say this is subject to it, this isn't subject to it, and still Senator Manchin, Senator Sinema, and others would have to sign off on this. But that's the focus of the lobbying campaign right now, because they really are at a standstill. Biden today, you just saw the speech that was probably the more forthright and heartfelt and strong statement as he's had so far as president, calling out the big lie and connecting it to these current efforts. But none of that changes the math. This is essentially a PR game. Of course, it's a stunt by the Texas Democrats, and it's not one where they can say, here, we do this, this, and that, and things are going to break our way. They're going to need to change their minds in a significant way and pretty quickly.
And Zorine, you heard Rick mention these Democrats. He referred to them as fugitives. And, you know, the Texas governor there, Greg Abbott, saying that as soon as those lawmakers do come back, they will be arrested, even saying, quote, cabined inside the Texas Capitol until they get their job done. The Texas House voted today to have the sergeant at arms of the House send for all the members who were not present and even arresting them if necessary. So can the governor really do that? Are we going to see these lawmakers in handcuffs being brought in?
It could look particularly dramatic. Look, the governor has vowed to keep holding these special sessions until these lawmakers come back. And when they do actually come back, when they enter the state, he can actually have state troopers forcefully bring them right back to the Capitol here. We don't know exactly how this scenario is going to play out and what it's going to look like, but it could highlight exactly how much everyone thinks is on the line. Bills surrounding voter restrictions have passed in 17 states. These lawmakers think that everything is on the line, that this could continue happening throughout this country. They don't see this as a Texas issue. They see this as a national issue. And that's exactly why they're in D.C., why they're going from senator to senator to try to get them to see exactly what they're seeing. They feel that democracy is at stake and on the line.
All right, Rachel Scott, Rick Klein, Zorine Shah, thank you all.
Thank you.
All right, let's continue the conversation and talk about what's next for voting rights in Texas. Gilberto Hinojosa is the chairman of the Texas Democratic Party. He joins us now live to continue what we have been talking about since President Biden spoke there in Philadelphia. So, Gilberto, the election bill is not the only thing that Democrats are walking away from in this special session. I mean, there's other issues like domestic violence prevention, border security, all of that at stake at this point. So why is voting rights taking precedent here?
Because that's where it starts. I mean, that's ultimately what this fight is all about, this session and this special session. The Republican Party saw some of the closest margins in an election in 2020. We had Joe Biden lose Texas by 5 percentage points. That was half of what Hillary lost in the last election. We almost took back the state house, but lost 9 seats that would have flipped the House by a total of 23,000 votes. And every year it's been getting closer and closer. So the only thing that the Republican Party can do now in order to prevent a ultimate victory by the Democrats here is to start getting these laws passed that will prevent particularly people of color from going out to vote or make it more difficult for them. That is the only way they can win. If you look at the turnout in places like Harris County and Dallas County, we had unprecedented numbers of Hispanics, Mexican Americans going out to vote, something that we had never seen before. African American turnout was huge in all these areas. In the state of Texas today, 70% of the people live in counties controlled by Democrats. This is what the Republican Party is worried about, and this is why they're focusing on trying to make it more difficult for people to vote. And even all the other items that are listed on the agenda for the special session, these are all issues that are part of the right-wing based demand that the Republican Party do this election cycle. This is what Abbott is doing. He's got a tough re-election in his primary. He's got two right-wing Republicans running against him. He's got to get as far to the right as he can possibly get in order to be able to survive the Republican primary, and that's what this special session is all about.
And Chairman, Democrats in Congress have criticized Republicans for using the filibuster to block federal voting rights legislation. So how is this any different?
Well, it's completely different because the filibuster was a law that was created. It is a creature of the Jim Crow era. It was created in order to prevent laws from passing that would benefit the minorities in the Deep South, not just voting rights laws, but civil rights laws. What we believe is happening right now is that the Republican Party is trying to pass these same kind of Jim Crow laws that were thrown out with the 1965 Civil Rights Act in the state of Texas to make it more difficult for minorities to be able to vote. What happened in the civil rights movement was people stood up to these Jim Crow laws all across the state of Texas, the South, and they used their ability to march, to walk, to have demonstrations, to have boycotts, to have sit-ins, to do all the things of civil disobedience, to change the laws to make sure that African Americans in the Deep South had all the rights that all Americans had. That's what our legislators are doing here today. And let me tell you one thing that's important. 3/4 of all the state representatives in the Texas House are people of color. And what they're being asked to do here by the governor demanding that they be in Austin is that they're being asked to form a quorum in the state house in order to pass voter suppression legislation that will make it more difficult for people of color to vote. Essentially what they're doing is if you've got a firing squad and you've got a relative out there in the firing squad, they're asking you to put bullets in the guns that are going to be used to shoot their people. They don't want a part of that. They don't want to be a part of a process that is rigged right now in the state house. And that's why they decided to leave, to go to Washington, D.C., and to show these folks up in Washington, D.C. that this is something that needs to change, and it's completely in their hands to do it. They have the ability to pass these laws. They have an ability to make sure that this filibuster rule is not used to prevent these voting rights laws to be passed. Look, in 1965, there was a filibuster, and the Deep South people filibustered the 1965 law. But what happened at that time is that the Democrats and the people that were fighting against the Jim Crow system in the South, they held on until the people that were fighting against the Civil Rights Act weren't able to go any further, and they passed the 1965 Civil Voting Rights Act. That's what we need to do here, is make it more difficult to use the filibuster rule, not use it during these kinds of, not allow it to be used during this kind of legislation so that people can have their right to vote. I mean, we had more people vote in the United States than in the history of the entire country, and more people in the state of Texas voted than in the history of the state of Texas. In fact, the Secretary of State of the state of Texas, who is a Republican, stated that the 2020 election was the election that was most free of fraud than any other election in the history of Texas. Yes,
so Gilberto, let me ask you, here we are. So what do Democrats do now? And can't Governor Abbott just call another special session if this measure fails? Because right now it's like a massive cat and mouse game.
Well, there's a lot of people upset at him, not just Democrats. I mean, we had a crisis occurred 3 or 4 months ago in February when the whole electric grid failed because the Republican Party hadn't done enough to protect it, and had not done enough to weatherize our systems to make sure that if it did freeze, we wouldn't have what we ended up having, which is people basically freezing to death. We lost 400 to 500 people died as a result of this freeze, and 9 million people were without electricity. What is he doing to try to fix this? Passing a voter suppression law? People in the state of Texas are wondering, why is he not doing his job and passing laws or trying to get laws passed that are going to benefit Texans? During the pandemic, we lost 52,000 people in the state of Texas as a result of the pandemic. Why? Because we had a governor that didn't pay attention to business, and because we have a state that has more uninsured, more people without access to health care than any other state in the country. What has he done to try to fix that, to try to close that gap, to expand Medicaid, to allow people who are poor people or moderate income working people to be able to get access to health care, which would have prevented many of the deaths
well,
that we had then.
Now we're going off into so many other subject matters when we want to stay focused here on voting rights. And so I ask, where do Democrats go from here? Your daughter, she's a representative, Gina Hinojosa of Austin there, part of a group of lawmakers who left the state. And she spoke with us earlier this morning. What do you make of Governor Abbott's threat to arrest her and her colleagues when they return home? Do you think that'll really happen? Obviously, it would be a very dramatic moment. It would make news. Answer that for me, please. And then tell me, where do Democrats go from here, staying focused on the voting rights issue?
I know my daughter pretty well, and I think she would be proud to be arrested in defiance of Mr. Greg Abbott. But she's a relatively young woman. I would like to see Mr. Greg Abbott send a DPS trooper to arrest State Representative Alma Allen or State Representative Sangrona Thompson, who are in their late 70s right now. Have them arrested and carted away in cuffs, in the presence of hundreds or thousands of people that are going to be watching this when this occurs. How is that going to affect him and his image, not just with Texans, but Americans all over who are going to be watching such a drama on TV? I think, there's a saying that goes, be careful what you wish for. Mr. Abbott, if he wants to arrest our people, they will go. They will not go unless they are arrested. If he wants to do that, look at what's going to happen in terms of the television cameras going on while he's arresting these people. The reason why we got a Voting Rights Act was because George Wallace in Alabama decided to send troopers to start beating up people when they're crossing the bridge in Selma, Alabama. That's what got the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. If he does something like that in Texas, I think the impact is going to be the same. People are going to be upset that he's spending resources and arresting people who are just simply trying to ensure that people's rights are protected in this state. That's what it's all about, and that's what I believe, that we have these courageous legislators today in Washington, D.C., who are up there fighting for us today and will continue to fight for us. And when they come back, they will continue that fight as well. And if it has to be handcuffed and dragged into the state capitol, I promise you they will be willing to do that.
And I have a feeling we will be talking again, and probably with your daughter as well. Texas Democratic Party Chairman Gilberto Hinojosa, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.